Why are there so many Black people in Paris? Believe it or not, Kevi gets asked that question a lot, and usually he has a response. And that's a good thing, since he's the founder of Le Paris Noir, a Paris walking tour company that specializes in helping clients get a view of the City of Lights from a Black perspective. We first met Kevi in 2017 when he was featured on the Black Expat. Then, the Martinique race Parisienne discussed why he created his company to address the gaps in French history. Now, as we get to the end of 2020, he's sharing his thoughts on what's the same and what's changed since we last spoke. A lot has been happening in France when it comes to cultural identity, and we take a deep dive into that conversation. We also explore the immigrant landscape, why the word multiculturalism can be seen as a threat, and the increasing visibility of Black French stories. And lucky for us, Kevi has got some recommendations on the ladder. Welcome to the Global Chatter. Kevi, bonjour, bonsoir, how are you?
I'm very good. Thank you for having me.
I was about to ask you how you're doing in French, but then I realized most of my audience doesn't speak French. So I don't want to throw them off. So tell me, are you in Paris right now?
I am in Paris.
That's a very French thing to say.
I'm locked down in Paris.
I was going to say, sorry, you live in Paris? I'm curious,
Yes.
Have you lived in anywhere else in France besides Paris?
Yes, I lived 3 years in Bordeaux as a child, from 6 to 9. And then I studied in Rennes, in the west of France, in Brittany. I lived there for 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And now
and tell me a little bit, even backing up. So let's... Ooh, hold on. I think we have a delay. Kevi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you, right?
Okay, perfect. I thought we had a little bit of a delay. Let's back up a little bit. So you mentioned you lived in Rennes and you've lived in Bordeaux. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And was there a third place you lived outside of Paris, or that was it?
That was it for France.
Okay. And I know that Martinique is part of your story. So for people who don't know, tell us about Martinique.
Yeah, sure. I'm very used to introduce Martinique because when I introduce myself and I tell people I'm from Martinique, if you're not French, you might never heard of it. So Martinique is a small island in the southern Caribbean, north of St. Lucia. And Martinique used to be a French colony, but we don't call it that anymore because the word colony doesn't really sound good. So the official word is part of the French overseas. So there's a bunch of territories all across the world that used to be French colonies and now are part of the French Republic. So if you were born there, you are therefore a French citizen.
So is that like for Americans, for example, is that like the US and Puerto Rico?
That would be similar, kind of. So I tell people our political status is somewhere between Hawaii and Puerto Rico. Because I know that folks born in Puerto Rico who live in Puerto Rico, I'm not sure if they are voting for all the elections in America. I'm not sure about that. And Puerto Rico has like an official flag and is in the Olympics and everything. Martinique is not.
Gotcha. So halfway in between, I got you. And so tell me about even Martinique, like what's the makeup, what's the demographics, who lives there, Black and brown folks, white folks, like who's in Martinique?
Yeah, so Martinique is a typical Caribbean island whose most of the population is Afro-descendant, which means people who are the great-grandchildren of enslaved Africans, mixed with people from different parts of the world, especially from South Asia. After the abolition of slavery, for multiple reasons, there's been important migrations of people from India. So there is that, and of course, there's also a connection with Europeans, which is not always a very easy identity to navigate. But Martinique is, we would say, part of the Black Atlantic.
Very cool. And that's actually a very cool term. I love hearing even like Black Atlantic because I never think about it that way, but that's such an awesome way to describe it. And so was your family originally from there, and how did you live there, or what's your relationship?
So I grew up there. I was born and I grew up there most of my youth. My parents are both from Martinique. My father grew up in Martinique, and my mom grew up in Africa and in France. My mom grew up in Ivory Coast and Togo, and then in France. And she moved back to Martinique as a young adult. So I also have a sort of different perspective, because a good part of my mother's family on my mother's side lives actually in mainland France.
Oh, wow. Oh, my goodness. And so I guess for you as a child and as a young man, how did you see your own identity within family being from Martinique, having a mother who's lived in different continents, and then, of course, France being the motherland, if you will?
Well, for me, it has been what you would call, in an American context, you would call that code switching. So from 6 to 9, I lived in the southwest of France. And then when I moved back to Martinique, I could not speak Creole anymore. I had a southern French accent, and it was awkward, and it was not very welcome. So by the age of 9 or 10, I understood that the way you speak to different people is important, that sometimes people get offended just because you say something a certain way, and it's not your fault, but it's the background that is attached to the way you speak. And so this is something for me that helped me quite young to try not to be completely focused or to think that something is normal everywhere. Like everybody, every culture has their own things that are welcome or frowned upon. So that's what it brought me from a very young age, especially questions of white and black identity. Like you go to France and then you come back to Martinique, and some people accuse you of becoming white. I was like, no, I'm still a black person. What are you talking about? So there is this relationship that has always been first challenging, and then for me now it's just fun. Hello?
So I think I can hear you. Sorry, it got a little bit quiet, but we're good.
Oh.
I think what's interesting to me is how you learned how to code switch really young, and ultimately I think that's going to be something that's helpful in the work that we talk about what you're doing right now. And so obviously you were navigating between Martinique and France, and so I guess my curiosity is, at what age did you move back to, or not back to, but what age did you move to France permanently as an adult?
Yeah, age 20. Age 20 as a student, and this is when I moved to Rennes to study political studies there.
Okay. And so I assume, like other people, it's probably because most of the main universities, if you wanted to study, were going to be in France, right? Unless there are major universities in Martinique.
There's a university of Martinique, but I was accepted in a very good school. So for me it was almost anticipated that at some point I would move to France to study.
Okay. So take us to this point. You're in France, young man, you've been in Martinique. We've already talked about code switching. Did you feel, now that you've gone back to France, did you feel that tension now living in France as a young black man who grew up in Martinique?
Yeah. There were lots of challenges, like cultural challenges. It's a different country, even though like technically I have a French passport, like everything is so different. So I had to adjust, but I must say that I feel like I was quite lucky when I moved to Rennes, which is not a really big city. It's not a small town, but it's not a huge city like Paris. And I would say social encounters a little bit softer, more gentle than in Paris, the big city. So I made friends quite easily, and we just all came from different parts of France, and we were making fun of our differences, but it was not like really a subject of, I don't know, animosity or me feeling rejected or something like that. It was not easy every day, but I was blessed to make friends quite fast enough, and they became like almost like a new family to me.
And so, how long were you in Rennes?
I was there back and forth because at some point I moved to Barcelona for 1 year. I studied in different parts, but mostly I spent 4 or 5 years in Rennes.
Okay, and then where did you go from there?
So I studied 1 year abroad in Barcelona as a Erasmus, the European exchange program. So I studied in Barcelona for 1 year. It was very interesting, not necessarily on an academic level, but more on a cultural and human level. It was very inspiring and challenging in the way that everything was Euro something, like come to the Euro party, we're all Europeans. And when I was meeting with people, and they would ask me, okay, so everybody would introduce themselves. Okay, I'm Paolo, I'm Italian, or me, I'm German. And then I would say I'm French, and then people would ask French from where? I would say Martinique, then people would say Martinique, it's in the Caribbean, what are you talking about? You're not really French. And then it raised so many questions about myself. I was not necessarily offended, but I was like, yeah, these Germans are right. Why don't I challenge this identity a little bit more? And then a year after that, when I moved back to Rennes, some of the white people of my school, of my cohort, because we all spent a year abroad when we all came back to France, they were like, you know what? I've spent 6 months in this country. I've not seen a single black person in 6 months, and it's amazing. It led them to ask themselves a lot of questions about why are there black people in France, etc., etc. So yeah, I think traveling is also leading to lots of really questions that you don't necessarily address before being exposed to your new environment.
So let me ask you, because I feel like you've touched on something really powerful. It's this idea of you're meeting other people, and it seems like they don't necessarily assume that you are French, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, of course.
And so, man, I want to dive into that, especially someone who's living in Europe. When people tend to think of the French, and I already know the answer to my own question, but what is it that you think that they assume or perceive?
Well, the first thing is when you talk about France, especially as between young European men, it's a lot of stereotypes about what a real French person is. And not being French, not being perceived as French is not always a problem if you're Italians or Spaniards who don't like French people so much. Like, no, you're not like these really arrogant, dumb French people. You're not like that. I don't see you as a French guy. So it's not necessarily an insult. But then on a more serious level, it is, I would say that France presents itself as a European country, which it is, but France is also a country that is present for a long time in the Caribbean, in the Pacific Ocean, in the Indian Ocean, and still is. And France is not really introducing this part to the world, doesn't really know how to address that, does not really consider itself as something else than European. So when I'm in the middle of Europe, surrounded by Europeans, sometimes I'm like, what am I doing here? I should, instead of like trying to befriend Germans and Swedish people, maybe I should meet with people from St. Lucia or people from Haiti or Jamaica or Trinidad and Tobago. And sometimes it feels to me that because we're still in a way a French colony, these opportunities were taken away from us, we are always going to be, part of the European Union and doing things with people who do not really see us as like their own kind. And for me, that's also something that we need to address.
And
I don't know if I
so tell me. No, you totally did. And to be fair to you, it was a loaded question, right? Because I'm asking you to sort of get in the mind of someone who's not you to answer that question. And so I'm curious then, even this concept of French identity, right? I'm curious as to how you see the country in reality and also theoretically sees multiculturalism, because you just mentioned all these places, right? And if anybody doesn't know, my family is Cameroonian, right? So all these places that France has had a foothold in. And so how do you think then I guess the country sort of sees multiculturalism when you have all these people that maybe are French but are not necessarily seen as French?
Yep. So I think France is already de facto a very multicultural country. Not only in Paris, like people sometimes want to say that it's only Paris that is multicultural, but it's not true. If you go to Marseille, to Lyon, to Lille, to Bordeaux, lots of different parts of urban France, you will see lots of diasporas and a lot of people from different parts of the world being born French and seeing themselves as French people. I think the problem is more on a political, intellectual level, where words like multicultural are very scary to a French traditional Republican, and I use air quotes when I say Republican, mindset who would accept that. Like the idea of talking about identity too much for a lot of French people is a threat. So myself, for instance, I work as a tour guide. I do tours about the Black history of Paris, focusing on people from the US, the Caribbean, or Africa who spent some time in Paris at some point, intellectuals, artists, and so on. And for some white French people, they don't like it. They think one should not delve too much into like the history of a minority or a community, because in France there's no such thing as a minority or a community. Everybody is French and equal and the same. So of course the reality is way more complex than that, and so that's why I think issues of blackness in France have to be addressed.
And so I mean, and that's so very, I think to a certain degree, very different in the US, right? Is that
to the point?
I guess we get go.
No, I was saying to the point that whenever someone is trying to engage on a conversation about identity, what you would call identity politics, the reaction here is to say this is Americanization. This is you are being inspired by conversations that are legitimate in America, but are not in France, because we don't have problems of discrimination, of racism, of police brutality, of a difficult colonial past. So we don't have to talk about all of these things like that. And I'm like, okay, France, yeah.
I'm like, wait, hold on. So, and that's the thing that has fascinated me more than anything about France, right? Is that I wondered about this. I get the idea in theory, right? That you want people to be seen as one, right? Because if they see themselves as one, they move as one. I get that. I don't think it's a bad thing, but I think that to ignore that you have different groups kind of creates some of the problems that people don't want to admit that they are there. And so, I have been, the fact that you said the Americanization, I was just thinking about that because obviously in the US, as everyone sees our media,
Yeah.
we talk about everything, whether anybody wants to talk about it or not. Right. So I wonder then from your experiences and just what you've seen, there are so many dynamic groups in France, right? So just even coming with a Caribbean identity or an African identity or an Arab identity, where do you think, where have been the problems in not addressing the fact that there are differences? Like, where do you see, this idea of being one is great, but this is the impact?
I would say in different elements, in different fields, I would say that I see this lack of conversation around identity. I would say, for instance, if you talk about cultural representation, if you talk about what you see on TV or in movies, the presence of Black people on French pop culture is bad. Really, really bad. To the point that if you're my age, I'm in my 30s, and you grew up watching French TV and American TV, you would be like kind of ashamed of French TV. I know, of course, there's a lot of racism in America, but at the same time, I grew up watching The French Prince of Bel-Air, and I had examples of young Black people doing cool stuff and doing their own things, being unapologetic. You would never see that on French TV, or it's very, very recent. When we talk about how big it is or how bad it is, I would tell you that the first Black man to, to be the anchor on the news, on the news, like on TV, on the major French channel, on TF1, I think it was in 2005. That's very, very late. So
wow.
on that, and so whenever you would love to, whenever you wanted to raise a question about, hey, wait a minute, how come there's no Black people on TV, or every Black person on TV is an awful caricature? How come people will tell you, I don't see color, it's not really important, it's just a detail, it doesn't really matter. So that's one example. Something else that I've realized doing my research for my tour is also in politics. If you think of France in the 1950s, before decolonization, at a time when the French Republic was trying to hold on their colonies, if you watch pictures of the 1950s, whether it's the Senate, the government, or the House, you would see more Black men than in 2020. So in that way, in the 1960s, there was decolonization. Okay, everybody go home. Everybody, or almost everybody, is independent right now. And all of a sudden, all the institutions became completely white, to the point that, and it feels like our history was whitewashed. For 20 years, between the late 40s and the late 1960s, the president of the French Senate was a Black man from French Guiana. And
wow.
Nobody remembers that. It was like number 2 in the hierarchy of power. Like, right. No other European country would do something like that. France did, and it was weird and amazing at the same time. And 50 years later, there's no Black History Month. We don't know about the guy. Everybody forgot about him. So not talking about that is allowing these kind of things to happen, I think.
And so, can I just, I don't know if you know, so why is that history not like, well, forget that part. This is the real question. Why in that period of time was there more visible Black leadership than there is now?
Because France used to have a lot of colonies. These colonies were mostly in North Africa, West Africa, Equatorial Africa. So at some point, if you're trying to be a democracy and you're trying to keep these territories, of course, they have to be represented in the parliament. So you had people like Senghor, before he became the president of Senegal, he was a congressman in the French parliament,
right.
involved in the writing of the constitution. Same thing for the president of Côte d'Ivoire, Félix Houphouët-Boigny. He was a very important minister in the French government. He was at some point the Secretary of Public Health in France.
Okay.
And
so you were trying to keep
it's so different, yeah.
Wow. So then I guess here's the, what do you think right now, just from your, and I'm picking on you because I know you went to Le Sciences Po, just from your political history reading and whatnot. Why do you think right now the representation, are people still fighting to get into those positions, and what's keeping the representation from being what it needs to be to represent all of France?
I am not sure, to be honest. Yes, of course, there are still some fights to improve representation, and I would tell you that in the past few years, it got a little bit better. There are a couple of movies who made me happy about how Black people are in our society, in politics.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's very complicated. There are like a few Black politicians who are visible, but they're not my cup of tea. Let's say it like that. And yeah, so it's still a work in progress. I would say that on my side, with some friends, we started a podcast like 3 years ago, and it's all about pop culture and a Black point of view on pop culture. And it was something quite new and surprising in France, like for French media to think of pop culture as something that could be analyzed through the lens of race is something really, really, I would not say controversial, but like very surprising, to the point that I don't know if you think of a movie like Get Out, like a French journalist could almost see the movie and say, yeah, the movie was very interesting, but I don't see anything so racial about it. You know, that level of influence. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, that movie was so racial. If you missed it, you weren't trying to find it.
Yeah.
So, okay. So then here's what I'm curious then, right? So obviously grew up in Martinique, grew up in France, and we'll talk about Le Paris Noir in a moment. But
yeah.
Are you telling me then, when you think about media, right? So if you're a young Black or brown person in media, are you then, if you're seeing Black and brown representation, at least up until the recent time, are you really seeing it from the US or other parts of the world, or you're not seeing it at all?
You see it from the US a lot because of the power of American culture. Of course, everybody's exposed to that culture, and I would think that for a French minority, it is easier sometimes to look up to American culture because you see a representation of minorities who are empowered and who have agency, who are not just like the magical Negro or the young thug or something but something different. Also, there is a field, I think, where brown and Black people in France take more and more pride. It's French hip hop. Like there is a strong French culture of hip hop that is led by people of different racial backgrounds, but mostly minorities. And I would say that if you look at some French rappers, of course, what they're doing is inspired by American culture, but they're also inspired by things coming from African or Caribbean culture, and they are like French icons right now. So it's not just looking up to Black American culture. There's also, through music, I would say, not only but especially through music, the expression of a Black French identity, or like a French counterculture.
Nice. And I'm going to hit you up about some suggestions later on. So you need to start making a list in your mind. Okay. So, all right, I'm going to hit the stop to take a pause. We're going to reset, and then I'm going to get into Le Paris Noir. All right. So you've already alluded to this, and I want to get into this because I think what you're doing is super, super cool in France. So you have a project called Le Paris Noir.
That's right.
And so for the people who don't know, tell them what Le Paris Noir is.
Le Paris Noir is an ensemble of tours in Paris, walking tours, where I take people around following the steps of important black icons from the black world who at some point moved to Paris. And for me, the idea started about 7 years ago. I was already a tour guide. I was already doing walking tours in Paris. But at the time, I was working for a company who was doing tours for mostly Americans, but it was not about minorities or post-colonial studies, black studies, or anything like that. It was a very, let's say, mainstream Paris. And I enjoyed the work as a tour guide, but it felt to me something was missing. I had a lot of questions from, international tourists coming to Paris for the very first time and being surprised by, let's say, the diversity of the population in Paris. So I had a lot of questions that were basically asking me, why are there so many black people here? So this is how it started.
Sorry, no, that's always a funny question to me. Go ahead.
But to me, the idea is powerful. The question is powerful because if you go to New York City for the first time, you're not surprised if you see black people there because of TV, movies, and pictures and everything. And why are you surprised when you come to Paris when there's lots of movies being shot in Paris? It's because black people are not really part of it. So I think that's an example why representation matters so much. So this is how the project
when
started.
When someone goes on a tour. And so I was going to say, so when someone goes on a tour with you, you're doing the tours both in English and in French, correct?
Yes, that's right.
And so where are your clients coming from? Are they coming from France, other parts of Europe, around the world? Where are they coming from?
So before COVID, it was mostly Americans. Mostly Americans. So it could be tourists or students. For instance, I worked with a lot of American schools. And now that 2020 is such a mess, you already know, most of the clients are French people. So I do mostly tours on the weekend, on Saturday and Sundays, group tours for French people, black, white, brown, and I take up to 20, 25 people and I show them around. And people are very interested in these questions right now because Black Lives Matter is a real issue, is a real question. Here in France, we have issues of police brutality. Also, there are lots of young black people who are born here and who know nothing about their identity, nothing about their history, and to hear that there is a walking tour showing the contributions of black people has a real significance for them because it means, in a way, they are legitimate to be walking with their head high, their chin up in the center of Paris, in these beautiful streets. They are 100% allowed, and they should be proud of that history.
And so I'm curious because you obviously are seeing a lot of French groups during this period, and you've been seeing a lot of North American groups before. What do you think are the responses different to the information that you're sharing?
Of course. Yes. So I would say that the first interesting reactions I get from Americans is when I start the introduction explaining how the conversation around identity is different. And one example that is really surprising to them is when I start saying France is probably the most diverse country in Europe, but I say probably because we don't have official numbers about it. There's no ethnic statistics. There's no ethnic statistics in France. And the first reaction is, you mean you don't have a census in France? And I say, yeah, of course. Of course, there's a very serious census for a very long time in France. And they ask you dozens of questions, nothing about your race. And they're like, oh, but why do you do a census for them if you're not asking that? So it just shows how it is two different worlds, two different political worlds. So that's a very American reaction, I would say. And on the French side, one question I get a lot is, why don't we ever hear about that? Why don't we know about the president of the Senate? Why don't we know that there's been a representation of Black people in France, at least since the French Revolution? When I talk about the first Black congressman, it's in the 1790s, etc., 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 and we don't know that. Or even the idea that, in France, school is in a way the same. What I mean is the curriculum is the same for everybody in every school in France. So what you're going to study in your school in Lille is the same as in Marseille, is the same as in Martinique. And before 2001, the history of slavery and transatlantic slave trade was not part of the national curriculum. So to the point that there are a lot of people who are my age, who grew up in mainland France, and the only thing they learn in school is like, I don't know, like 3 or 4 lines in their textbook, and that's it.
Do you ever get pushback? Do you ever get people who are who think that maybe you're being too political or problematic in what you're sharing?
What I have, well, on the tour, no. On paper, a lot. So when I start the tour, I don't really care of your political opinion, who you vote for. Everybody is going to be treated the same, and I'm going to be nice and polite with everybody. So no matter what is your opinion, I'm open to talk about it, and I'm an adult, and we can have conversations. The problem is people who never took the tour and have their own agenda and opinion about what I'm doing. So it happened a couple of times that I'm doing a walking tour with a couple of people while on the tour, and someone who is not part of the tour sees a group of Black people with a Black tour guide talking about history, and they want to share what is on their mind. And sometimes it gives sometimes it gets I try to de-escalate, but at the same time, I still have to be, respected when I'm doing my work. So one very significant example is in a street in the neighborhood of Saint-Germain, there is a plaque dedicated to a young Algerian Frenchman who was killed by the police in the 1980s. So there's a plaque with his name on the street, explaining what happened. But one element is missing, is who killed him, the police. So it says Malik was killed in 1986. He was 22. It was a protest, and he was killed. And for years now, activists write down by the police, par la police. So I was explaining it maybe 1 or 2 years ago to a family of Black folks from Tennessee. And all of a sudden, an old white French woman interrupted me, asking me, "Why are you talking about that?" And I replied, "Because this is my job, this is part of what I do, etc., etc." And she asked me, "Why don't you talk about the resistance? The people who fought the Nazis in the 1940s. And I was like, that's not what the tour is all about. And so I stopped the conversation and I said, "Okay, have a good day, man." And my 2 Americans were like, "Yeah, what is happening?" And I replied, "Well, you remember the introduction where I told you that some French people don't like talking about identity? Here is a case."
Right.
Yeah, there's that.
The idea that somebody would interrupt someone in the middle of their work to give their opinion about what they should be talking about. I can't. And so do you find that in the work that you've done, and I know you've been doing this for several years now, are there things that you've learned that you didn't even know when you first started doing this work?
A million things. And that's why I want to be very humble about it, because some, especially Black French people on the tour, they say, "Oh my God, I feel ashamed. I didn't know about that. I should know." And I said, "Listen, I studied political studies. I grew up in Martinique. I lived for a long time in the neighborhood in Paris where all these Black intellectuals were, and I worked a couple of years as a tour guide, and I knew almost nothing about them. And if you don't really know anything about James Baldwin living in Saint Germain and writing masterpieces in the middle of Paris, it's not only your fault. It's because the city of Paris and the educational institutions don't talk about him so much, or as much as he would deserve. So let's all be very humble about it. And here is a list of books or documentaries that could help if you want to dig a little bit more. And myself, doing these tours, I have met with so many interesting people that helped me to shape the tour. For instance, I work with American students, so American universities and American teachers and professors, and there are so many talented people doing amazing things in Africana studies, Black studies, etc., that are like some sort of supports for the tour. I've been doing this tour for 7 years, but it keeps evolving and changing, and it's because of all the research and the connections I have been able to get.
And so let me ask you this, because it is Le Paris Noir, and I think I know the answer to this, but in your tours and in your history and what you're sharing, is it a broader Black experience? So is it history of Black French? Is it history including Black America, Black Africa? Like what's the Black that's in it?
No, it's a very good question, and it's a question I get often. I'm not the first Black person doing tours of the Black history of Paris, but I think I was the first French one to also trying to include a Black French narrative. What I mean is, before there were tours that were mostly talking about James Baldwin, Richard Wright, Josephine Baker, and many amazing American artists who spent some time in Paris. But I also wanted to include La Négritude and Alexandre Dumas and the history of the African soldiers during World War II. So that was very important to me. And when I say Black, I try to be as wide as possible. The idea here is not trying to say that Black Americans are not part of that experience because they had a different position in Paris. No, I think Paris is actually a city where Black people from different parts of the world throughout the 1900s, it was a place where they could meet and compare their experiences and their visions. It was not always easy. There's been lots of dispute, but there's always been this sort of this sort of place where someone from Senegal would meet someone from Martinique, would meet someone from Chicago, would meet someone from French Guiana and Congo, etc., etc. So that's what I'm trying to do.
And so I'm curious, especially as we're in the the 2020s, and this has been a very big conversation. As you're telling these histories and you're telling these stories, do you get to the point of current events? Like, for example, obviously you being in France and being in Europe, immigration has actually been a big issue, I think, in France for a long time, but it's been very big an issue of the last couple of decades. Do you get up to the point in terms of current history or current events, or do you leave it at a certain point in history?
No, that was important to me to include current events, because if it was only about things that happened 100 years ago, I could be in a room telling people stories. But if I take people around, I also need to talk about what is happening at the moment in Paris. So I have two main tours. One that is more historical, on the left bank of Paris. Another one that is much more about the past 30, 40 years. We go to a neighborhood named La Goutte d'Or around Château Rouge. And it's not really an African neighborhood. It's even more than that. It's an African hub. Like you have like markets and tailors and hair salons and cafes and restaurants and places for the African diaspora. And it's a neighborhood that has a bad reputation. I remember a few years ago in America on Fox News, they called the neighborhood a no-go zone, which is it is not a no-go zone. I've been running tours there for 7 years, and it's not the jihad or anything like that. It's a very interesting working class, vibrant, immigrant African area, and it's also a way to talk about difficult times, difficult moments. We talk about, for instance, deportation of African immigrants. It is something that took place in the neighborhood in the 1990s, for instance. But we talk also about the evolution of a sort of French Afro culture. You have, for instance, a lot of members of La SAP. La SAP is this movement that is originally from Congo, of some sort of African dandies, African dappers. And so Chateau Rouge is the place where they meet. So there's this so there's this guy named Le Bachelor, and Le Bachelor is the leader of all the sapeurs. And so when his shop is open, he's always like welcoming us and sharing anecdotes, funny stories with us. And so it is a very interesting place where there are also questions of gentrification. So yeah. So there are current events also that I mentioned. I don't want to only talk about, dead novelists or something like that, but also about what is happening at the moment.
No, that's a really good point, because you can only talk about the dead novelists so much, and they get a lot of attention. Yeah. But I think the work that you are doing is something we don't hear as much. And so, given with that, I mean, I know that France, like other European nations, kind of, was obviously impacted by the migration that's been happening. And how do you see, in a more expanded conversation, how do you think France is wrestling with immigration now in the 2020s? What does the conversation look like?
I think it's a very toxic conversation because I think it's very important to use the right words when we have very sensitive political discussions. And it feels to me that a lot of French people, including a lot of French politicians, don't know what is an immigrant, to the point that whenever there are, I don't know how to call it, but let's say urban problems, people blame it on immigration, on immigrants, when actually immigration in France right now is not so high. They are talking about people of color. And for a lot of French people, a person of color is always an immigrant. So they would tell you that their country is being taken away from them by immigrants, when the statistics about immigration are not proving that. What they mean is they see people of color around them, and it's challenging them. It raises questions about the way history is going to be told. It raises questions about the way religion is going to be discussed in our country, but it's not immigration. So I think that's two separate conversations, and in France we tend to, in a way, to I don't know, to create confusion with that. I don't know, I think an example, like a more concrete example I could give you, is the fact that a lot of Black French people get very offended if you ask them, where are you from? Or what are your origins? Is it because I'm Black that you're asking me this question? If I was a white person, a white French person, you would not ask me that question. I was born in Marseille or in Strasbourg. Leave me alone. So because there is the assumption that if you are a person of color, therefore you are an immigrant. I don't get offended by the question, where are you from? in France, honestly, because I was born in Martinique. So when someone asked me, Kevi, where are you from? I say, I'm from Martinique. End of the conversation. People are like, okay, cool. I see. But my friends who are born in Paris, etc., they get a little bit, they feel more attacked when you conflate the concept of, black equals immigrant.
Hmm. Mm. And do
Um,
you think
yeah.
that? And I was gonna ask a follow up question. Just, I actually will watch a little bit of French media just to see what's happening outside
Yeah.
of the U.S. because
Sorry.
sometimes you need to.
Sorry. Yeah.
I mean, it's only fair. The rest of you kind of get sucked into American politics, whether you want to or not. But I'm curious though. Are you feeling like just over the last 10 years, do you think the conversation has gotten more toxic, or it's just been, it hasn't gotten more, it's just been that way the whole time?
I think it has been that way the whole time, but I also think a sort of, colorblind conversation, like this sort of French Republican propaganda of there's no such thing as an ethnic minority. We don't know what you're talking about. It worked at least at the surface. It worked for some times, but now I think for younger generation, and when I talk about younger generations, I'm not only talking about black people. I'm also talking about white people. There are conversations that have to be addressed right now. I was telling you before about the Americanization of the French political debate. It's not only young black left-wing activists who are inspired by American politics. It's also on the far right. You have young white French people talking about white genocide. A few months ago, right after the death of George Floyd, there were lots of protests in Paris about police brutality, but the biggest one was very amazing because it was in Place de la République, and it was like a protest led mostly by people of color, and there was a sort of counter-protest organized by white supremacists, and they got on top of a building with a huge banner with written on the banner, "Stop the white genocides, white lives matter," in English. And I saw that and I was like, okay, who is being Americanized right now? Because this is exactly the language of the American alt-right. So I think these issues are changing, and maybe it gets a little bit more aggressive than before. You can tell that right now at the moment, you hear a lot of I would say reactionary talking points. For instance, when you have debates around freedom of speech, you would have white boomers telling you that because of social justice warriors, we can't say anything anymore and we're losing our freedom of speech. So very similar to something you would hear in an American media. Yeah.
And so let's take it even broader, because I know that unfortunately in the last very recent weeks that there's been some violence, obviously in France, and that, like I said, even though I'm based in the US, that information managed to pierce the middle of our election cycle. And so how do you, and this is just a dream question really, how do you think that France is going to be able to sort of reconcile these different groups, as well as having these other individuals who just feel like France is changing so much from whatever ideal that they thought it was, that that they're not necessarily willing to or want to kind of embrace some of these other black and brown folks? Because I know it's more than just obviously the black identity. There's an Arab identity. Sometimes it's a black Arab identity, but how do you think France is even going to be able to even tackle some of these issues?
I'm not sure. So when you talk about, for instance, black issues, you would talk more about I would say, inclusion, education, and things like that. When you talk about the Arab or the North African issue, you talk about secularism or laïcité in France, which is this idea that in public affairs, in politics, in government, there should not be anything religious at all, which is like a very big deal in France. And it was something that is a consequence of the French political history, the history of the revolution, the history of the French Republic, and so on. But right now, this concept, in a way, is instrumentalized or weaponized against Muslims to the point that you have politicians. When I say politicians, I'm not talking about like the fringe, I'm talking about politicians in our government who are being offended because you find halal food in every supermarket in France, and they say this is not a good thing for French assimilation to have ethnic or religious foods in every supermarket. That's not the way you promote unity in France. So when you are obsessed with tiny trivial detail like that, it just shows how the prejudice is big in the, I would say, on every level is what I mean. So I think we have to be a little bit less dogmatic about some ideological principles, and we should stop weaponizing things that were conceptualized 100 or 150 years ago to stop having real conversations about real things happening at the moment. Like Islam is the second religion in France. You don't have to use laïcité to in a way to persecute such a big minority. I think it's completely nonsense, and whenever we're doing something like this in France, we think everybody on the planet is on board with us. You know, like a few years ago, it was Muslim women who were being harassed when they were going to the beach because they were some of them were wearing a full swimsuit. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
and so I do. Yeah, so the police was basically disturbing them, telling them, sorry, ma'am, you have to strip down right now because your outfit does not respect the Republic. And everybody on the was like, what the hell, friends? Who does that? And like, okay, we're the only ones. Oh, but that's for their own good. It's for their own individual freedom. Don't you understand? Like, no, this is just like, yeah, you're going to get in trouble doing stuff like that. And so yeah, so sometimes we should, I think, as a country, take a step back and look a little bit how the others liberal democracies are doing before being so like, we sure that's the way to assure democracy or whatever. Yeah.
Do you so do you think then, I'm asking you these do you think questions, you could say, you could push back, but do you think then that are there differences between, just from your your experience, Black and brown folks who are, let's say, first, second generation in France and they see these issues versus maybe Black and brown folks who have come recently, who are, for lack of a better term, immigrants? So like, is there, are you seeing a generational difference in just how to even react 100%. To France with all of these things? Okay. And I'm talking specifically with Black and brown. Yeah. So tell me more.
I think everybody has a connection to what we call le bled. Le bled is not a specific place. The bled could be like a small town or village, and it's a concept that every child of immigrant has. Like, if your parents are from Cameroon and you live in Paris or in the suburbs of Paris, you would say that this summer you're going back to Le Bled, which is the place where your family is from. And so everybody has a relationship to the bled, and someone who comes directly from there is a blédard. And blédard might also be an insult for someone who is not adjusted to a French urban life yet. So there is this sort of attraction rejection that is very interesting with origins. Like you don't want to speak like a Blédard, but at the same time, Bled is the place that you would call home, even though you don't really know it that well. So I think it's a very interesting connection. Maybe you would have things similar with Latino or Asian American communities, right, in America. Like your family from Cuba, or your family, etc. So there is that, and I don't know. I think France is a country of assimilation, and it's something that the French institutions are. They say it with pride that France is a country that usually knows how to assimilate. So the idea is you might come from China, Italy, Spain, it doesn't matter, Madagascar, whatever. You will come to France and you will adopt French culture. Your children are going to be born in France and be a French citizen like anybody else. And we are not going to mention anything to the origins or anything like that, to the point that you see that a lot with interracial dating, which is something that is quite seen as positive in a French context as a sign of assimilation. So I remember a few years ago, I went to an exhibition in a French museum in Paris, and it was about racism. And there was this board with a very interesting statistics and facts. They were explaining that yes, children of immigrants have to go through a lot of discrimination, or more discrimination than anybody else, but the vast majority of them marry someone from the general population, so it's all good. Yeah.
So you're saying some stuff that it's kind of setting off in my brain. And I will admit, it's a very American brain, so things get set off. Even so, this idea though, like when you said someone always kind of has this home place, right? Whatever it is, before you got to the place, is there? I'm trying to reconcile that with the fact that people would still ask a Black person in France, though, where are you from, right? So at what point do you stop being from Dakar, right, from Senegal, and are just French? At what point does that happen? And let me tell you why I asked that question. I love football.
Yes.
Oh. I watched a lot of the conversation around the World Cup, right? And I felt like this was part of the conversation when you looked at the team, right? At what point, though, are you just French and you're no longer whatever country your family came from?
That's you started to answer the question. When you win the World Cup, then you are 100% French. That's the answer. You have to do something amazing to be 100%. No, but I remember. So just two things about that. The first one is about a year ago, I was lucky to meet with an American journalist, Gene Demby. He came on one of my tours. He's the co-host of a podcast named Code Switch, and I invited Gene on my own podcast, Le Chip, and we made a special episode in English. And at some point, we talked about the French national team. And this conversation for me, the conversation between Americans and French people about our team was like a car accident in slow motion for me. Because I saw the way you guys on social media were excited about our Black African national team, and I knew that French people were not going to take it. Because the conversation here is so different. The only people who would call them Africans here in France
right.
were the far right. The only people who would say, look at this African team. It was not like Black Americans on Twitter being proud of them. It was like, this is a disgrace. We cannot go to the World Cup with such a Black team. So when French people see online other people from the outside, whether they're black, white, whatever, saying, "Oh yeah, look, the African team won the World Cup." They're like, "How dare you?" And this is where, from my point of
Right.
view, it is a lot of BS, because 10 years ago, when the team was very bad, the players of the team were on French media. Some French media called them Islamist thugs.
Mm-hmm.
Racailles islamisés in French. And then 10 years later, they win the World Cup. And whoever dares to question their national identity is a Nazi. So I'm like, okay, well, calm down a minute, please.
Right.
Yeah. So, but on the other side, when there is, for instance, the national, but the American basketball team doing great, no one is calling them an African team, even though the whole team is African American. They say, okay, that's the American team, and so
Yeah.
I understand, like, from the players' point of view, from the point of view of the black French players, their reaction was very politically correct. They replied, "We are players of the French national team. We are very proud to represent the national flag. Our only colors are blue, white, and red. Period." Because they knew it was going to be like a sort of crazy conversation. Yeah.
And you know that's so different from the U.S., right? Like if we black, we gonna tell y'all we black and the black people did it, and that's just gonna be that. And that's and I mean, part of it is you've already said this in the beginning. Part of it is we have the media, we have the voice, we have the numbers compared to other groups, and so. And of course, there's a different history. There's some shared history, but there's a different history. And so how we, of course, look at race and achievement. I mean, we can see that even now happening with Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, right? And I don't know how much you follow. I mean, I know you're on Twitter. I know you're on social media, so you see this stuff. Like, you can see the pride. And even taking it back further, right? Barack Obama, right? That when he became president, look, we didn't care where his black came from. Okay, we made sure to say he was black, and to be fair, he has a white mother, right? So he's biracial, but you know, we're very comfortable with saying, you know, putting the race at the front. And so, but I love that you gave that insight and just how it looks different in the way France approaches it, right? Because, you know, we wouldn't say it that way. We wouldn't be worried about that.
I remember in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected, I cried like a baby, and I was very moved, obviously. And I remember also white French people, some of them being moved and understanding how symbolic and historic it was, but also some people being sarcastic about it. You know, like, yeah, but it's still an American president. It's not your president. Blah 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 blah. And I feel very. I feel a lot of empathy and solidarity with what is happening in Black America, because I grew up looking up to, I was going to say the Cosby Show with my family, but no. But like other things, but like a lot of Black greatness comes from America, like a level of Black excellence that is, of course, an inspiration to all of us, to the point that sometimes Black French people would feel like, in a way, in the world of Blackness, it's the American narrative that takes much of the space, to the point that we know, in general, I'm saying, I don't want to generalize too much, but we know more about you that you know about us, in a way.
Well, and you know that's because our media is loud and global. And we speak English. I think that's just the three things. I think it's just that we have large numbers, we have an insane media machine, and we happen to be English speaking, and that's just that's not a slight to French, German, Swedish, whatever. It's just a lot of things have come together to make it. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of things have come together to make it that way. So this brings me to a really good spot that I want to do with the lightning round, and I'm gonna do it a little bit
Yes.
different with you. I have
Shoot.
3 questions, and
Yes.
you have dropped so much knowledge. So I want you to keep dropping knowledge.
All right.
Okay. So and I love this segue. So given all you've done, first question: if somebody just wanted to get a taste of understanding a little bit about Black French culture, history, literature, whatever, what's one book you would recommend?
On the political level, something short and old. I mean, it's old. It's from the 1950s. It's Discourse on Colonialism by Aimé Césaire. Aimé Césaire is a poet and a politician from Martinique, very important to us. Is one of the few Black writers who is part of the French pantheon. You know, like this sort of all the legends of French culture is part of them, and it's a very harsh and honest and blunt discourse on French colonialism and what it did to us, and it's right after World War II, and is making a sort of brilliant case on what colonialism gave to fascism, which is a very, very controversial statement in the 1950s. And something much more recent that is not a book, but it's a movie. It's a movie that came out 6 months ago in France, and it's named Tout simplement noir, just simply black. And it's a mockumentary. It's a fake documentary. It's a comedy, and it's about a young Black actor who is unemployed, is not really woke, but all of a sudden he's trying to make a march for Black men, for Black people to express their frustration and their anger and how they need to be visible. He starts saying, in America, Black people are respected. In France, we're just a joke, so I want to show them. And the whole movie is an exploration of Black actors, Black athletes, Black intellectuals. So he's going to meet with real people who are playing their real parts. And it's just a sort of exploration of what is being Black in France in 2018, 2019. The reaction for the reception of the movie was interesting because mainstream media were quite favorable with the movie. They say, okay, it's interesting. They have some fair points. Black French activists, some of them got somehow offended because he's also making fun of some activists in the movie. But for an outsider, I think watching this movie, and I think there will be a global adaptation, global release, that the movie will be dubbed, and hopefully sometime soon it will be on Netflix or on some streaming platform. But I think for an outsider, it's a great way to understand what are the questions and the issues for the Black community, especially when it comes to media, but also dealing with the police and politics and a lot of different things. Tout simplement noir.
Okay, I got it. I've made notes. It's going to be in the show notes. Second question. If you are coming to Paris for the first time and you just want to get a snippet of Black culture in Paris, what neighborhood or quartier would you recommend for someone to go?
It's a complex question because the nightlife is not really organized as it would be in a big American city. What I mean is you don't have a tradition of Black-owned business in a Black neighborhood that is a Black club. You have like places scattered around where young Black people would go, like bars and nightclubs and stuff like that. But I don't think there's one neighborhood that would really be like the neighborhood of the Black nightlife. Now that I said that, there is a bar that I like a lot. It's a Martinique bar. It's named Le Beau. It's in the Latin Quarter, which is actually not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Latin Quarter is like the intellectual neighborhood for a very, 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 very long time in Paris, and it's also a neighborhood where a lot of Black intellectuals used to live in the 1900s. So I think symbolically, even though right now it's a very uptight bourgeois neighborhood, I think as a matter of let's be in a neighborhood where we're not expected. I think Beau is dope, and it's a place where you will find a lot of young Black people who are there to drink amazing rum in a really cool environment. It's a safe space. You can speak Creole. It's dope.
Sweet. Third question. If you wanted to be introduced to some really good contemporary Black French musical artist, whether it's R&B, soul, pop, hip hop, rap, whatever, who would you recommend for someone to listen to?
Oof, too many. At least 5. At least 5.
Okay, give us your 5. Who are your 5?
I would say right now at the moment there is she's not French actually, she's from Belgium, but like, you know, Belgian artists, it's like Canadians to us, they are part of our industry. So and right now like Belgian.
I'm laughing because I'm just laughing because I've never thought of like Americans thinking like the Canadians to us, but I immediately knew what you meant. Sorry, it was just a funny thought.
Like Drake being the biggest American star when he's Canadian, right?
Right. That's
so
fair.
There's
That's
this
fair.
young female artist. Her name is Luz and the Yakuza. And so she's Congolese and from Rwanda, but she also grew up in Belgium. And she is like a rising star. She just released her first album, her debut album, a few weeks ago. She was on Jimmy Fallon, but you know, like on the internet, like not there for real because you can't travel at the moment. But she just released her first debut album. It's named Gore, and Luz and the Yakuza is so talented. She's really, really, really cool. Even her aesthetics is quite powerful, so I would recommend Luz. As a rappers, I would say Isha Isha is also from Belgium, and he has a song about Europeans arriving to Congo, and it feels a little bit like the lyrics. It's a little bit like if it was aliens coming to Earth and invading the planet, but it's from the point of view of a young African man who's like 15, 16-year-old, and the lyrics are beautiful and sad at the moment, but the music is upbeat, and I think it's at the same time conscious, and you feel like dancing on it at the same time, and it's beautiful and very, very, very beautiful. And last but not least, I think he's a legend. He's like the biggest French rapper for 20, 25 years. His name is Booba. And he's a French rapper who is a sort of... You don't have so many rappers who have like a 20 years career and are still very relevant, especially for the younger generation of hip-hop. So if you listen to the whole discography of Booba, you have like a feeling of the evolution of French rap these past 20, 25 years. And you get to see that it's quite... dense and amazing. I don't like everything he does, but he's so big, you cannot talk about French rap without mentioning Booba.
Oh my gosh, you've given us a list of things that I gotta put in the notes. Oh my gosh, thank you so much for all that information.
You're welcome.
You gave multiple answers for every question. It was never one. I was like, okay, I've got to read this book, this artist, this whatever. And so, Kevi, thank you so much for coming on. You have dropped the knowledge.
Thank you so much.
I just appreciate you being here. And so, no problem. And so we're gonna have. We're gonna drop the information to Le Palais Noir on the website as well as in the notes, as well as your social media, so that when we are able to travel, people will be able to link up with you when they get to Paris, because I know that the kind of folks that listen in love this sort of stuff. And so I want to make sure you get your shine.
Yeah. And you will be surprised, but I miss Americans. Like I have not interacted with American clients for like 8 months now, and as a French person, I never thought I would say that, but I miss Americans. Paris is not the same without Americans looking for stuff.
I mean,
yeah.
We're kind of like, you know what we're like? We're like that drunk cousin, right? Like when they're around, you're like, oh my God, my drunk cousin is loud and annoying. But then you don't see them for a while and you're like, I miss that fool. Like that's us. I'm okay with that. That's us. Thank you so much. And I will catch you all on the next time.
All right.
The Global Chatter from the Black Expat is hosted by me, Amanda Bates. It is executive produced by Justin Williams. You can find all episodes of The Global Chatter on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your podcast.